Brothers and sisters, today we celebrate the feast of St. Francis of Assisi. This great saint who's captured the hearts and minds and imaginations of so many for centuries. Not only Catholics, but so many people kind of look to him in sort of awe and respect for the kind of life that he lived. So radical was his life, so radical was his decision to follow the gospel that it has literally shook the church and has transformed the church in many ways. As Dominicans, we call Francis Holy Father Francis because St. Francis was of the same time of St. Dominic. Together, they really were an unfolding of the plan of God in the life of the church. All the good things God had stored up in his heart for all eternity starts to be given and unfold as the church unfolds over time. There are many gifts that probably still yet in the Lord's heart that he wants to unfold. But at this amazing moment of Francis and Dominic, there's an introduction into the life of the church of these mendicant orders. So orders that are not monastic, as completely stable in one place. Monks who live the gospel, try to imitate the gospel in a community, trying to be faithful to the gospel, and therefore take vows of stability to a monastery, to a place, and often very much open to great hospitality to people who are visiting the monastery, as Benedict would say, see those visiting the monastery as Christ. But Francis and Dominic wanted to, I suppose, imitate Christ and the apostles. There was a great apostolic movement at this time happening in Europe, where there was a great consciousness to try to restore Christian life to the apostolic way, to the way how the apostles lived. Especially, there was a whole movement of poverty happening in Europe. But sometimes these new movements or groups were going away from the traditional Catholic faith, or from the faith that was always handed on since the apostles. And so there were a bit of distortions. And so Francis and Dominic reacted that in their own ways. And Francis, he in his own life, he was a troubadour, kind of, going around, songs, and he lived a high life. He came from a wealthy family, so he had a good life, and there were so many things that were attracted to him amongst his friends at the time. But eventually he would have a conversion and reversion back to the faith, and he would literally renounce everything and follow this most amazing, intimate following of Christ. And then there's the famous scene at him in San Damiano, where the crucifix spoke to him, saying, "Francis, rebuild my church." And Francis thought at first that this was literally to rebuild the broken church, or the church had fallen into ruins at San Damiano. But eventually, I guess over time, even that word to Francis would make sense as time goes on. And, God speaks to us words in our own life that might take time for us to unpack and unfold. We understand it on one level, but Christ speaks on so many levels. And so Francis had to really unpack that message, or that call over time. And there were times where he had no idea where things were going, but he would cry out to God, "Ayuda me, help me, Lord Christ, help me." And so Francis, he then becomes the founder of the Franciscan Order, and therefore the whole Franciscan family, with all the different branches that have since come about since the founding of the order in the 13th century. And it was a radical commitment to the following Christ in humility and poverty, and preaching by life. By Francis is famous for saying, let the sermon be your way of life. Let people read the gospel by your way of life. And so Francis would very much encourage that. But at the same time, Francis was a man who also spoke and preached actual words of the gospel, and so were his friars. Think of someone like St. Anthony, who was a great doctor of the church and famous, one of probably the most well-known Franciscan saints, St. Anthony of Padua, and he was a great preacher. So, even they say he preached, and even the fish came up to listen to his sermon. So the story is, that is a great conformity to the gospel. And so his life was a preaching, but also he met that life with words, actually preaching the words of the gospel, fire. And so he was a man of devout prayer. We forget that in early part of the Franciscan, and it remains in their spirituality, that many of the brothers were to go to hermitage, not only just preaching and wandering about, but there were times where they were called to hermitage and silence and devout prayer. And Francis has rules about that, about how the brothers are to gather in hermitages for prayer. And Francis himself would retreat into solitude, because he knew the tremendous importance of prayer as well, and not only in just the busy apostolic mission, but first his life was dedicated to prayer, to listening to God in silence, to fixing his mind upon the Lord. And so there are many witnesses of Francis to us, and he's certainly raised up an order that has given to the church so many saints, so many wonderful saints in all this different way. We think of St. Padre Pio, who was a great Franciscan, a Capuchin, part of the Capuchin branch of the Franciscan family. And he too, like Francis, had the stigmata. Francis is the first man in history that we know had the stigmata, when he received the stigmata on Mount Laverna. And so we pray to him that we too may have our lives radically conformed